He displayed ancient weapons. But one question no one expected: the transport case had wheels that squeaked. That was the first thing Vreth noticed when a human rolled it into the staging hall. Not the human himself, not the official badge clipped to his shirt, not even the size of the case. Just that small, embarrassing squeak every time one of the wheels hit a crack in the floor. Vreth had been assigned to help coordinate the cultural exchange presentations. He had processed 17 species so far. The Drenkai brought crystallized music. The Aluan brought living fabric that changed color with emotion. The Shorvith brought a plant that could survive in vacuum and somehow smelled like rain. The human brought a squeaky case. Darren Cole was not what Vreth had pictured when he read the file. The file said cultural historian, weapons conservator, 12 years of field work across 3 continents. Vreth had imagined someone larger, someone with the look of a person who handled dangerous things. Instead, Darren was average height, a little tired around the eyes, wearing a plain gray jacket with a small ink stain near the left pocket. He had a paper notebook tucked under one arm. Paper. Actual paper. He parked the case in the center of the staging area and straightened up. Solek was already there, hovering near his data tablet, antennae twitching. Solek was Drenari, small and precise, and he had been calculating presentation impact scores all morning. He looked at the case the way he looked at everything, like it was a problem waiting to be properly labeled. "You are the human presenter," Solek said. "Not a question." Darren Cole, the human, said, and put out his hand. Solek looked at the hand, then back at his tablet, then shook it once with 2 of his smaller fingers. "Your filed materials listed cultural artifacts. Category: historical objects. Subcategory was left blank." "I left it blank on purpose," Darren said. "That created a processing delay of 4 hours. Sorry about that." He did not sound particularly sorry. Vreth stepped forward. "We reviewed your transport manifest this morning. There were some concerns raised. About the weight distribution, about the contents." Darren nodded slowly. He reached down, unlatched the case, and opened the lid. Vreth had prepared himself. The manifest had listed the items in plain language. He had read the words. But reading words and seeing the actual objects lying in their foam-cut spaces were 2 very different things. There were 12 items. Each one was clean, carefully mounted, held in place by fitted foam that had been shaped to each object individually. The oldest ones were behind thin preservation glass. Some were obviously replicas. Some were not, at a spearhead made of gray stone, chipped into a point, that a short bronze sword with a worn handle, that a crossbow bolt in a sealed case, that a long musket with a wooden stock, dark with age, that a bayonet, that a pistol, and others. Arranged oldest to newest, left to right, like a sentence written across centuries. Solek made a very small sound that was not quite words. Vreth said nothing for a moment. "Then, these are weapons." "Yes," Darren said. "You have brought weapons to a cultural exchange presentation. I have brought artifacts to a cultural exchange presentation. Those artifacts happen to be weapons. There is a difference." Darren looked at him steadily. "That is exactly what I am here to explain." Word moved fast in the coordination hall. Within 20 minutes, 3 other species representatives had come by to look. Within 40, Advisor Kun had been notified. Kun was old, scaled, and had been on the High Council for longer than some species had held galactic membership. He arrived with 2 staff members and stood at the edge of the staging area, looking at the open case, the way someone looks at a problem they expected and are not pleased to see confirmed. "This is inappropriate," Kun said. "Weapons have no place in a cultural diplomacy setting. The purpose of this exchange is to build goodwill." "I understand the concern," Darren said. "Do you?" "I do. And I can tell you that nothing in this case is functional. Nothing is loaded, strung, or capable of causing harm. They are historical objects under conservation protocols. The oldest one is roughly 400,000 years old. It could not hurt anyone even if I wanted it to." Kun looked at him for a long moment. "The issue is not physical danger. The issue is message. What message does a species send when it chooses weapons as its cultural offering?" Darren said, "That depends entirely on what they say about them." The council session to decide whether to allow the presentation took 1 hour and 11 minutes. Vreth sat in the back and listened. Several delegates argued for cancellation. Several argued for a modified version where Darren presented only images of the weapons rather than the objects themselves. Khan argued for cancellation clearly and without much patience. The final vote was close. Darren was allowed to proceed. Security was increased. The human was informed that any presentation content deemed aggressive or destabilizing would result in immediate removal. Darren received the news standing in the staging hall, still next to his open case. He read the message on his communicator, put it in his pocket, and looked down at the 12 objects lying in their neat foam spaces. Vreth had stayed nearby. He was not sure why. Curiosity, maybe, or something closer to nervousness. "Are you concerned?" Vreth asked. "About the conditions?" Darren was quiet for a second. He looked at the spearhead, at the bayonet, at the small sealed case with the crossbow bolt. "No," he said. "These things have survived everything already. A council vote is not going to be what stops them." He closed the case. The latch clicked. The wheel squeaked once as he rolled it toward the main hall. Nobody talked in the 30 seconds before Darren began. The main chamber held 412 delegates from 61 species. Some were large enough that they took 2 seats. Some were so small they sat on raised platforms just to see over the presentation table. The air was filtered to 3 different atmospheric blends simultaneously. The lighting had been adjusted 7 times before the session started to accommodate species that saw in ranges humans could not. Darren stood at the front. He had no display screen behind him. No projected images. No music or atmospheric effects like some of the other presenters had used. Just the table, the open case, and himself. Thought he reached in and picked up the first object. It was the spearhead. Flat and gray, smaller than human hand, the edges still sharp-looking even after everything time had done to it. He held it up so the room could see it, then set it gently on the table in front of him. He said, "This is roughly 400,000 years old." The humans who made it did not have a name for themselves yet. They did not have writing. They did not have cities or roads or any of the things that usually get called civilization. What they had was this. Solek, seated in the 3rd row, had his tablet open. Data incoming. The animal they were hunting that season, Darren continued, weighed approximately 400 kilograms. It had thick hide, strong legs, and it was faster than any human over flat ground. The humans who hunted it were smaller, slower, and had no natural weapons of any real use. No claws worth anything. No teeth built for fighting. Nothing that made them obviously suited for what they were trying to do. He paused. They went anyway. A small sound moved through the chamber. Not quite a reaction, more like an adjustment. "But here is the part one want you to hold on to," Darren said, "because this is the part that matters." He reached back into the case and took out the second object. He set it next to the spearhead on the table. It was a needle. Bone thin, with a small eye drilled through the top end. It sat in a clear preservation case, no bigger than a finger. "Same dig site," Darren said. "Same layer of earth. Same approximate period. Same hands." The chamber was quiet. The person who napped this spearhead, or someone who lived in the same group, also made this needle. They used it to sew, to stitch animal hide into coverings that kept their people warm. The weapon and the needle were made at the same time, by the same community, for each other. Solek's stylus had stopped moving. Vreth, seated near the side wall, looked at the 2 small objects on the table. A pointed killing tool and a thin bone needle. Side by side. He found he did not have an immediate thought ready. "I want to be clear about what I am not saying," Darren continued. "I'm not saying early humans were peaceful. They were not. They fought each other. They competed for food and water and shelter, just like every other species that has ever tried to survive. I'm not here to make them sound better than they were." He looked out at the room. "I am saying that in the same breath, in the same season, with the same hands, they made something to hunt and something to heal. That is the pattern I am here to show you. Not the weapon alone. Never the weapon alone. Always the thing beside it." Kun, seated in the elevated council tier, had his arms folded. His expression had not changed, but he had not looked away. "Humans spent a long time believing they were special because of their tools," Darren said. "We spent even longer believing we were special because of our weapons specifically. There were centuries where the best weapon maker was the most important person in a community. Kings and generals got the stories. Warriors got the monuments. He picked up the spearhead again and turned it over in his hand. But the needle survived too. It does not look impressive. It does not look dangerous. Archaeologists almost missed it. It was found in a small pouch near the body of someone who had lived a long time, longer than most people lived back then, which means someone had been keeping that person alive, feeding them, caring for them, using that needle to keep them clothed and warm. He set the spearhead down very carefully. 400,000 years ago, on a planet that had not yet decided what it was, a human made a weapon to face the outside world, and then made a needle to take care of the people waiting inside. He looked at the room. That is where this story starts. Nobody spoke. Not because the session rules required silence. Because nobody had anything ready. Solek looked down at his tablet and then closed it with a soft click. He did not open it again for the rest of the part. Vreth sat with his 4 hands folded together and looked at the 2 small objects on the table. A spear tip and a needle. He had cataloged the cultural offerings of 16 other species that week. He had scored them on engagement, diplomatic warmth, and symbolic value. He did not reach for his scoring form. Darren left the 2 objects on the table and stepped back slightly, giving the room a moment. Outside the high windows of the chamber, the station's light cycle was shifting. The room got a shade warmer. Nobody moved to end the session. The bronze sword was about 60 centimeters long. Darren held it by the handle, which had been rewrapped at some point in its history with dark cord that had since hardened to something closer to wood than fabric. The blade had that particular color that old bronze gets, a kind of green-brown that looks less like metal and more like something the earth grew. "This is roughly 3,000 years old," he said. "It was found in a river in what is now Central Europe. Swords like this one were used in wars that most people on Earth have never heard of. The kingdoms that fought those wars are completely gone. The borders they died for no longer exist. Nobody alive today speaks the language of the soldiers who carried blades like this one." He sat on the table. "I want to talk about the people who lost those wars." Kun shifted slightly in the council tier. It was a small movement, but Vreth noticed it. When historians on Earth study this period, Darren continued, they have a tendency to follow the winners. The empire that expanded. The general who won the decisive battle. The civilization that survived long enough to write things down. That is natural. Winners leave more evidence. They build more monuments. Their names travel further. He picked up the next object, an iron gladius, short and heavy-looking. But here's what I find more interesting. The people the Romans conquered, the Celts, the Gauls, the tribes along the northern rivers they lost. Their kingdoms ended. Their political structures were erased. In many cases, their languages were pushed out or absorbed entirely. He paused. Their songs survived. Another small movement in the room. Not restlessness. Something else. Celtic music exists today. The patterns, the scales, the emotional structure of it. These things pass from parent to child in the dark, in villages that Rome had claimed, in communities that had been told, formally and forcefully, that they no longer existed as a political entity. The empire wrote the history. The defeated people kept singing. Solek, who had not reopened his tablet, said quietly from the 3rd row, "Why? What is the strategic purpose of preserving cultural expression under occupation? It carries risk. It provides no military advantage." Darren looked at him. Because someone loved it. Because someone's grandmother sang it, and they could not let it disappear. Because love is not strategic. Solek absorbed that. He did not have a follow-up question. Darren reached into the case and removed a small object, flat and sealed in preservation material. He held it up. "This is a reproduction. The original is in a museum in Rome. It is a letter written in Latin by a soldier to his mother. It was found buried near a battlefield in what is now northern France. Estimated age, roughly 2,000 years. The soldier describes the weather. He says it is colder than he expected. He asks if his sister had her child yet. He says he hopes the harvest was good. He set it down next to the gladius. He carried a sword. He also carried this. And at some point, possibly before a battle he did not survive, he buried it. or someone buried it with him. Either way, someone thought the letter mattered enough to keep. Vreth found himself looking at the reproduction and the sword together. The same kind of pairing as the spear and the needle. Weapon beside something softer. Harder thing beside more careful thing. Darren moved along the table to the next group of objects. A Mongol composite bow, unstrung, its layers of wood and horn visible at the curved tips. A medieval longsword with a simple crossguard. I'm going to say something that may sound strange, Darren said. Humans spent roughly 1,000 years improving the design of the sword. 1,000 years of refinement. Length, weight, balance, edge geometry. Entire schools of combat that treated the sword as a science. He picked up the long sword and held it with both hands, carefully, like something that deserved care. In that same 1,000 years, humans invented the hospital. Not a place where soldiers went to be patched up before the next battle. A dedicated place, run by people whose only purpose was to keep strangers alive. People they had never met. People who could not pay. People from other cities and other faiths. He set the sword down. In that same 1,000 years, humans invented the university. The idea that knowledge should be gathered in one place and taught to anyone willing to come and learn. Not just the children of the rich. Not just future soldiers or priests. Anyone. He paused. In that same 1,000 years, humans wrote the first love songs. Not hymns. Not war poetry. Songs specifically about the feeling of caring about another person so much that you had to describe it out loud, just to understand it. The chamber was the quietest it had been since the session started. The sword got better, Darren said. And so did everything beside it. Advisor can unfolded his arms. It was a slow movement, like something loosening rather than reaching. He placed his hands flat on the council table in front of him. He did not speak. But the wall that had been visible in his face since the beginning of the presentation had developed something in it. Not a hole. Not yet. Just a line. Darren carefully lifted the medieval longsword and placed it back in its foam space. Every weapon in this case was made by someone who also made something else, he said. I want you to keep that in mind for what comes next. Because the next part of the story is harder. He did not explain what he meant. He just moved to the next group of objects. The flintlock pistol had a crack in the wooden stock that someone had repaired a long time ago with a thin band of copper wire wrapped tight around the wood. It was a small repair, careful, done by someone who wanted the object to last. Darren held it for a moment before speaking. This era of human history is difficult to talk about well, he said. So, I'm going to try to be honest rather than careful. He set the pistol down. Humans spent roughly 200 years building empires with guns. Not the defensive tools of small communities. Not the hunting weapons of people trying to feed their families. Guns built into systems of control. Guns used to take land that belonged to other people. Guns used to enforce the idea that some humans were worth less than others. The chamber held its silence. I'm not going to tell you that was complicated or contextual. It was wrong. Humans who lived during it knew it was wrong. Many of them said so clearly. They were usually ignored. Some were imprisoned. The empires continued. Vreth glanced toward the council tier. Kun was still. Not the rigid stillness of hostility. Something more like attention. Darren picked up the Civil War rifle next. Longer, heavier, with a smooth, worn area on the stock where a hand had held it thousands of times. This is from a war humans fought against themselves. 1861 to 1865. On the North American continent. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died, more than in any war the nation had fought before or after for a very long time. They fought over a specific question: were some humans allowed to own other humans as property? He put down. The side that said no eventually won. What came after was imperfect. It was slow. Many of the people who had been enslaved spent the rest of their lives in conditions that were technically different but practically similar. The nation failed them repeatedly over the following century. He stopped. They stayed anyway. They built communities. They made music. They raised children. They kept fighting through legal systems and protests and direct action for another 100 years until the laws finally changed in ways that began to mean something real. They did not leave. They made the place that had treated them so badly into a place they were willing to fight for. A delegate near the back of the room had put down their data tools completely. Just sitting, listening, Darren reached into the case and took out the World War I bayonet. It was plain. No do querastion. This was used in the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Approximately 20 million people died. The war was started by political decisions made by old men in rooms. Most of the people who died were very young. He held it carefully. Christmas, 1914. The war had been going for 5 months. The trenches were full of mud and cold, and men who were dying from diseases as much as from fighting. On Christmas Eve, soldiers in the German trenches began lighting candles. Small lights along the top of the trench wall. Then singing Christmas songs, loud enough to carry across the space between the two sides, which was sometimes less than 100 meters. He set the bayonet down. Soldiers on the other side called back, then climbed out. Then the German soldiers climbed out. They met in the space between the trenches. No man's land, the place that existed specifically to kill anyone who entered it. They stood in it together, and they exchanged food and cigarettes and photographs of their families. Someone produced a football. They played. He let that sit for a moment. No officer ordered this. No government arranged it. No treaty permitted it. Young men who had been trying to kill each other decided, on their own, without permission, to stop for one day and be human at each other instead. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small seal preservation case. Inside was a dried red flower, flat and fragile. On Earth we call this a poppy. It grows wild in disturbed ground. After the First World War, it grew in enormous numbers across the battlefields of Europe. The soil had been so completely torn up by artillery that the seeds in the ground, which had been waiting for years, finally had space to grow. He placed the case on the table next to the bayonet. We use it to remember the dead. Every year, in many countries, humans wear this flower on their clothing for a period before the anniversary of the armistice. Not a trophy, not a symbol of victory, just a small red flower to say, someone was here, someone died, and someone who is still alive has not forgotten. He looked out at the room. This bayonet was used to kill people. It was also used by those same soldiers to open food tins, to dig latrine trenches, to cut rope and bread and the wire around packages from home, to toast bread over small fires. The same object used for the worst thing and the smallest ordinary thing. He paused for a long time. I do not know how to make that simple. I just know that it is true. Solek looked at the poppy, then at his folded hands. He stayed quiet. Vreth had stopped taking any form of notes. Advisor Kim was leaning forward very slightly in his seat. Just slightly, like someone who had been standing back from something and had taken a single step toward it without quite deciding to. The last weapon on the table was not impressive. That was the first thing anyone noticed. After the stone spearhead, after the bronze sword, after the bayonet and the rifle, the final object was just a pistol. Gray metal, standard shape, no ornamentation, nothing that made it visually remarkable. It could have belonged to any soldier in any country from the last 150 years of human history. Darren picked it up and held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment before saying anything. Then he said, this was carried by a man named in the records only as a field soldier, 3rd rank, during a conflict in Southeast Asia in the latter half of the 20th century. The war was long and it was ugly. The reasons for it were complicated in the way that most wars are complicated, which usually means that the people who made the decisions were far from the places where people died. He put the pistol down on the table. When the war ended, he went home. He did not speak about what he had seen. His family said later that he almost never spoke about it at all. He had nightmares for years. He struggled in the way that soldiers struggle when the thing they were trained for ends and they're handed back to normal life without instructions. He paused. He applied for a teaching position at a small village school. He taught children for 40 years, mathematics and basic science for most of it, though toward the end he also taught a class he designed himself on how to observe the natural world carefully. His students remembered him as patient, specifically patient. The kind of patience that does not get frustrated with slow learners, that keeps explaining in different ways until the explanation lands. He always had extra pencils for the children who forgot theirs. He kept them in a tin on his desk. Vreth looked at the plain gray pistol on the table. His students did not know about the war. They knew he was older than the other teachers, and that he walked with a slight difficulty that he never mentioned. They knew he was calm in the way that some people are calm, because they have been through things that burn the urgency out of them. They did not know what those things were. Darren looked out at the chamber. He carried this weapon for years and used it in the worst circumstances a person can find themselves in. And then he put it down and stood in front of children and helped them learn to count and think and look at the world carefully. For 40 years. He stopped. Solek had his hands folded on his knees. His tablet was on the seat beside him, dark. Vreth was very still. Kun's hands were flat on the table in front of him. His head was slightly bowed, though not in any formal gesture. Just the way a head drops when someone is thinking hard about something that weighs more than expected. I said earlier that I would be honest rather than careful, Darren continued. So I want to say something clearly now. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the room. Humans are not the most powerful species we have encountered in this galaxy. We're not the oldest. We're not the most technologically advanced. We do not have the longest history or the most established culture. We are new here, and we know it. He looked at the weapons on the table. All of them, from the stone spearhead to the plain pistol. What I have brought here today is not a threat. It is not a demonstration of military capability. I brought these objects because they're the truest things I could find to show you about who we are. And the truest thing about humans is this. He let the silence settle before he spoke again. We have always been good at building things that destroy. We are not unique in that. Every species that survives long enough develops ways to fight. What is unusual about humans is not the weapons. He picked up the plain pistol one more time. What is unusual is that we kept asking ourselves whether we should have. Every generation, every century, we built the weapons and then argued about them, wrote about them, painted pictures of what they cost, put flowers on the graves of the people they killed, built hospitals next to the battlefields, wrote love songs in the middle of wars, made schools in the ruins. He set it down for the last time. We never fully answer the question. We're still arguing about it now. But we never stopped asking. He looked at all 412 delegates, A.T. Solek with his dark tablet, A.T. Vreth with his four hands still folded, A.T. Kun, who had not moved in a long time. I have one question, Darren said. If that is permitted. Nobody said it was not. The chamber waited. The chamber expected politics. That was visible in the way the delegates shifted when Darren asked for permission to speak his question. Tablets came back up. Several delegates leaned toward their translators. Two staff members near the wall straightened into professional posture. Advisor Kun, who had been still for a long time, sat back slightly in the formal way of someone preparing to receive an official statement. They were ready for a request. For membership terms, trade access, military status, something that could be processed and debated and eventually filed. Darren asked, when your people made their first weapon, what did they make beside it? The silence was not the polished silence of diplomacy. It was the silence of a room where something had arrived that nobody had a ready response for. Vreth opened his mouth. He was generally quick. He had been a diplomat for 19 years, and he had a phrase ready for almost every situation. He could not find one. He closed his mouth. Solek looked at his tablet. He turned it on. He searched. He was Drenari, and his people had been cataloging data for longer than humans had been a spacefaring species. He searched for 40 seconds, which for Solek was a long time, and then he looked up at Darren with an expression that was not confusion exactly, but was something very close to it. I did not find a record of what accompanied the first Drenari weapon, Solek said. His voice was quieter than usual. The weapon itself is documented extensively. The surrounding context is... He paused. Not recorded. Darren nodded that he did not say anything immediately. He just nodded, as if this was something he had expected but still felt the weight of hearing. More delegates were moving now, checking their own records, turning to colleagues, speaking in low voices. The chamber had the feeling of a room where many people had just noticed the same gap in something they had assumed was complete, that a delegate from the All-Human species One of the tall ones who needed extra space leaned toward their neighbor and said something that the translation system rendered as, "I was taught that the first all-UN weapon was a cultural milestone. I was taught the name of the warrior who carried it. I was not taught anything else about that time." Kun had not moved. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on Darren. Darren spoke. "We found the needle the same day as the spear. Same layer of earth. Same location. Same period. For a long time, the spear was the important find. It was the one that got written about, photographed, displayed. The needle was cataloged as a secondary artifact. Domestic item. Less significant." He looked at the table where both objects still Saturday. We changed how we thought about that. Slowly. It took a long time and a lot of arguments between archaeologists. But we changed it. Because when you look at both objects together, you see something you cannot see when you look at either one alone. He picked up the needle in its small case. You see a community. Not just a hunter. Not just a survivor. A group of people who faced something dangerous and came home to each other. He set it down. "We have been looking," he said. "Since we first made contact with other species, we have been looking for the things you made beside your weapons. Because we believe that is the truest way to understand civilization. Not the weapon. Not what it could do. The thing beside it. What you came home to. What you made to take care of each other." He looked at Kun directly for the first time since the presentation began. "We have not found those records yet. For most species we have met, the weapon is well documented. The thing beside it is harder to find. We would like help finding it. Not to judge. Not to compare. Just to understand." Kun was quiet for a long time. The chamber did not rush him. When he spoke, his voice was level, but it had something in it that had not been there at the start of the day. "I do not remember," he said. "The first Veth weapon is part of our foundational history. I have known its name since I was young. I have repeated its story in council sessions more times than I can count." He stopped. "Then, I will have to look. I will have to look at what else existed at that time and ask why it was not kept alongside." That was all he said, but it was a different kind of silence that followed. The session ended without ceremony. No formal closing statement was given. Delegates stayed in their seats longer than they usually did. Some were talking. Some were not. Solek sat in the third row and did not stand up for several minutes. Darren began packing the weapons away. He did it the same way he had unpacked them. Carefully. Each object returned to its shaped foam space. Each case closed and latched. The needle case beside the spear tip, the way they had been found. Vreth walked over and stood beside him while he worked. "That was not what we expected," Vreth said. "I know," Darren said. "What do you think we will find when we look?" Darren latched the last case and stood up. "Something that surprises you," he said. "It always does. Humans were surprised too when we started looking. We thought we knew ourselves. We thought the weapons were the main part of the story." He looked at the closed case. Turns out the needle was just as old, just as important. We had walked past it for 100 years before we understood what we were seeing. He took hold of the handle of the transport case. The wheel squeaked once as he turned it toward the exit. Vreth stood in the empty presentation space and watched him go. Behind him, on the table, the lights were already being dimmed for the next session, but the table still had the marks where the objects had rested. The slight impressions in the soft surface covering. Spear tip and needle, side by side, 400,000 years old, and still arriving somewhere new.